in times of uncertainty, people fall back onto essential services. People fall back onto sectors where there's the minimum demand disruption. And so from all these different angles, I think it's the best is yet to come for the sector.
So welcome to the Blue Circle. Thank you for joining in today. It's such a big privilege and a pleasure to reconnect with everyone, our distinguished panelists who are handpicked because of the think input and the rich experience they bring in. And thank you to our distinguished audience for joining us. We've received over 350 plus registrations, 90% of whom are business leaders, CEOs and CXOs. Many of them are repeat visitors to our webinars. So this is highly encouraging for us and motivates us to provide even higher levels of dialogue, even through online media as well. For those of you who are new with us today, the Blue Circle is an exclusive ecosystem to help business leaders manage disruptive times and become future ready. We focus on five fundamental sectors, which are energy, EV, real estate, retail, and healthcare. We also present socio-economic insights, which ultimately determine the evolving complexion of the market. In response to the COVID challenge, the Blue Circle has also accentuated its digital presence. One of the many modes we employ is our weekly webinar series, our digital publication. We're also building a handpicked domain-focused expert pool drawn from within our leadership community, from our members and its associates, that will guide businesses during and post-COVID across these 5 sectors. In addition to this, you will also shortly see an exclusive digital platform which we're launching, specifically for leaders, wherein we will present them with the opportunity of connecting with each other digitally and also house high quality curated content and meaningful conversation through that platform. So those leaders who among you are interested are invited to write to us for that as well. And today we've invited prominent practitioners and thought leaders from the energy sector. Thank you all for joining us, sirs. And now in the best interest of time, I will quickly mention their respective names and designations. Mr. Ashish Khanna, President Tata Power, CEO and Managing Director, Tata Power Solar Systems. Mr. Christopher Beaton, Senior Policy Advisor and Lead, India Program, International Institute for Sustainable Development. Mr. Gagan Sidhu, Advisor, Center for Energy Finance, Council on Energy, Environment and Water. Mr. Neeraj Sharma, President and Managing Director, Wartsila, India. Mr. Vipul Tuli, Managing Director, Sembcorp Energy India and Chair, FICCI Power Committee. Welcome all, sir. And the moderator for the session is Mr. Pavan Choudary, author, CEO and public intellectual. Welcome, sir. Kindly note that we will have Q&A towards the end of the session. Some of you have already shared questions with us and they are with the moderator now. And now I request Mr. Choudary to please begin the session, sir.
So thank you very much, Siddharth, and it's a pleasure to be with you all and a pleasure to host such a distinguished panel of practitioners as well as advisors and scholars. So I have already received a lot of questions and more are coming on my WhatsApp as well as on Zoom. I will try to drive the narrative forward, keeping these questions also in mind and fitting them in buckets so that if not all, most of them are answered or addressed. So keeping in mind the time limit which we have is about 1 hour of discussion and then a few minutes of question and answer session. I would like to perimeter the discussion around some renewables. So the renewable sector, you know, means wind, solar, geothermal, small hydro, and biofuel. So we will try to focus on wind and solar and also bring any adjacencies from any other scholar or panelist who can provide the glue to integrate these sectors as well as connect these sectors more efficiently with the grid. And if we get more time, then of course we will look at the other other parts of the renewable chain also. So that was the parameter I propose, and the chronology which I propose is, let us start from when COVID happened and whatever changes it brought in the sector, and keep our spotlight trained on from then to the next 5 years, so that we have a boundary of time also of the points which we are making. So with these broad points, I would like to start the discussion, and I would like to start it with Gagan and asking him, how do you think, Gagan, this sector has changed since COVID, or how COVID has impacted the renewable space?
So let me just jump straight into that question, because that is the question of the hour. Power demand and economic activity are just so intrinsically linked that it should be no surprise that a strict nationwide lockdown, which was commenced on March 21st, caused power demand to fall really sharply. But as we're here to particularly focus on green energy, one way to open a discussion is to ask, well, how did renewable energy generation fare in the immediate aftermath of the disruption? And as it turns out, the answer to that question is that RE actually may have been a bit relatively less disrupted by the disruption. And let me explain what I mean by that. If we were to look at March 21st as a cutoff date and look at, let's say, 3 weeks before that and 3 weeks after that, and we look at the average daily generation, across all generation sources, what we saw was a decline of about 26%. For coal, we saw all sources, we saw a decline of about 20%. For coal, it was about 26%. And for renewables, it was down about 10%. Now, of course, there is a flip side to this, which is that for generators who are in the business of producing power, a fall in demand, however small, is a cause for serious concern. And from that perspective, a 10% fall in average daily generation, which is what RE suffered, is a big number. Now, I think understanding the real impact on green energy and what it takes to take it forward from here requires a far more detailed and nuanced discussion. And I guess that's what we're going to have today here with the fellow panelists. Vipul, as you were saying earlier, that there are certain headwinds, certain tailwinds that the sector sort of faces. Now, without really getting into too much detail, when I looked at the tailwinds or the pros that I saw in the aftermath of COVID, a couple sort of stood out. One was the fact that we had two successful tenders a couple of weeks after COVID happened, after lockdown began, and both produced pretty interesting results. One was a 2 gigawatt tender where the L1 was at ₹2.55. The other one was a 400 megawatt round the clock tender, which produced a L1 of 290. Now, granted that L1 for the round the clock is not really based on a true round the clock, but it is a step in the right direction. So clearly, one of the big tailwinds I saw was, despite the disruption, despite the fact that power demand as a whole fell so steeply, investors were still, and investors in this case are the investors backing the equity, who are last in line over claims, actually felt quite confident with that backdrop. So that clearly is one big tailwind for the sector. I think in terms of headwinds, one of the big headwinds is, well, how are these projects actually going to get project finance? The ones that are going to be successfully won in the next few months, next few weeks. How is project debt going to be raised for that? So that, for me, is the biggest headwind. And there's two aspects to that. One is pricing, and the other is availability of project debt. Now, on the pricing front, in theory, the repo rate is actually at a historic low right now. To put into context, it's at 4% today. It was 4.75% on the back of the global financial crisis about 10 years ago. Now, transmission of that onto MCLRs is another matter, but at least it's a step in the right direction. I think the bigger challenge is the availability of capital. Our lenders, and lenders in India, project debt, are banks and NBFCs. Are they going to be prepared to lend to a sector which has faced such a steep fall in demand? How do you convince them that renewables or power generated by renewables is going to be continued to be dispatched? That to me is one of the biggest headwinds for the sector.
Great points, and I like that you brought in the investors from the beginning only, because this will broad base our discussion, Christopher, and maybe make us ask questions like, is it too early right now to interpret the investor enthusiasm as positive? How will the supply chains of this sector change given the new geopolitics, and whether this sector can be in the raw materials and manufacturing in this sector, can it be indigenized fast? What are the other changes which you see along with these questions is what I'd like you to answer. Christopher.
Thanks very much. It's a great question. And I think that the kind of timeframes that you've introduced for the discussion are really helpful, and something that certainly in IISD we're seeing as we kind of monitor what different countries around the world are doing. It's helpful to distinguish, I think, between shock and recovery. So I think our kind of first 6 months is our shock. And in some ways, that's the easiest part to deal with. The recovery is the process of trying to build back better. And I think in this discussion, we already have our element of shock and our element of recovery. I think it's important not to lose sight as well of a third element, which is transition. So although we have a recovery where our timeline might be 3 years or 5 years, we also have longer term objectives for clean energy transition. And what we do now is going to have really long-term implications for whether or not we can achieve those. So I think those kind of concepts are key, and I think they kind of underline what we should expect in a range of areas. One of the things we've been trying to do in IISD on this topic is simply to track what is happening right now. We think that, and particularly with respect to the role of government. So our view is that governments are going to play a key role in determining outcomes in these three areas, and it really isn't guaranteed what those outcomes are going to be. So this is a kind of potentially a turning point historically. We've been working with a number of other organizations internationally to track what's happening in G20 countries, and I think that what we're seeing is the trends don't look great in terms of what are the levels of interventions that are being made to try and assist the kind of fossil parts of electricity generation versus the renewable energy parts. So the majority of the approved kind of stimulus measures linked to energy to date have really focused on fossil fuels rather than renewables. We're seeing countries weakening environmental norms, like South Africa, which has kind of halved the stringency of sulfur dioxide standards. We're seeing bailouts, like in South Korea, but it's not really clear if the right strings are attached. And countries like Australia, which are actively trying to expand, for example, coal mining to deal with economic impact, but much less in renewables. So I think this is an area where we need to see, more clear and specific recommendations for exactly what governments should be doing, both from think tanks like IISD and in the private sector. And in terms of the shock, I think we obviously, for all types of power generation, have a goal of just keeping the lights on. And the most important thing to me is making sure that in the kind of very short term, we're not making kind of permanent changes to regulation very hastily, to try to solve short-term problems. So I think we need the right tools for the right time period. So for the short term, we need kind of more short-term tools. For the medium term, I think that we need to be kind of asking ourselves, what's the role for renewables in building back better? And then for transition, just making sure we don't lose sight of India's broader objectives for renewables for 2022 and 2030.
Very good points. In fact, by bringing in the government role or the government's role as most important, you have underlined tacitly whether offshoring will continue as before, or it will be more friendshoring, or it will be indigenization. Will some groups of countries will flock together? So all those points have to come on the table. How will we handle that some countries have the minerals, some country may have the mineral as well as processing facility, as well as component making facility, and others may be largely dependent on it. For example, China in many cases, cobalt, nickel, some neodymium, and etc. So that also you brought out the fact that how the fossil versus the renewable debate will go on. How will it balance? Of course, there is no cause for great alarm, because whenever something new like renewable comes on the stage, it seems that tomorrow will be the complete day of renewables. Change will come, it will be far-reaching, but far-reaching doesn't mean erasing whatever is of the past. As I said on an earlier occasion, when internet came, we felt that shopping as well as education will happen now online. It has started happening online, but malls and schools and colleges were also very much alive. So change comes, but it does not mean it obliterates the past. Also, another point which you have brought up is haste. So a common dialogue is this is the new normal. After listening to you, I should say, this is not the new normal. This is the new flux. So if you, in haste, take a very long-term decision or change your earlier decision very fast, you may imagine you may be actually taking the decision on quicksand. You need to wait for things to settle, then make your changes in course. So coming to now Vipul, and Vipul, I would like you to add to what Gagan and Christopher have brought in, and continue this conversation a little more so that we cover it from 360 degrees as to how COVID has impacted the renewables sector. And I will also, after you, ask Ashish and Neeraj this before coming to the forthcoming headwinds and tailwinds we anticipate. Vipul.
Thank you, and thanks to Blue Circle for giving me an opportunity to participate in this. It's nice to see so many participants and a great panel. I'd like to maybe make 2 or 3 points about how COVID is affected, and then talk a little bit about sharing a perspective on what perhaps lies ahead for the sector. A bit of crystal ball gazing, perhaps. So first, in terms of the COVID impact, I would echo what Gagan said, that there was a sharp decline in demand, but most of that decline or volatility was picked up by the other sources of energy, and renewables was largely unaffected. In fact, I would say for renewables and in fact across the entire sector, one of the things that this has shown is really the resilience of the manpower in this sector, and the fact that within 3 to 4 days, I dare say, literally every site producing power across the country was back in action despite all sorts of obstacles, with new safety procedures, new isolation procedures, etc., etc. So I think that came back pretty quickly. As I looked at demand last about 3 or 4 days ago, we were back to, I would say, within about 5 to 10% of demand last year after adjusting for weather. Now, considering that Malls are still shut. Many offices are still shut. Industrial demand is still coming back to normal. To be within 5 to 10% of previous year's demand is actually quite a remarkable sort of spring back. Now, how that plays out in the coming months, we shall see. But certainly that's where we stand in terms of demand. So I think the resilience has been shown. Demand is back to a reasonable extent. And but I do also think that the Achilles heel of the sector, which is really around its financial and liquidity position, has been exposed very quickly for the sector, not just for renewables, but for the power sector overall. So if I look at sort of take that to as and say, what lies ahead, maybe three things to talk about. I think one is public opinion. I live in Delhi, which has the dubious distinction of being one of the more polluted cities. But as I look out of my balcony, and I can literally look for 15 kilometers down and see clearly down the line. Now, we're not hearing much about public opinion today, but I think when activities resume back, when the traffic is fully back, when construction activities are back, etc., at that point, we will see a section, if we'll see how large that section is, but we will see a different level of public opinion of people saying, look, I like what I had from a purely pollution standpoint. The second is, and so that should be positive for the sector. And the second is, where does reform and policy on the sector actually move? And I do think that, as Christopher and Gagan briefly touched upon, this is a highly regulated sector. At the end of the day, it depends quite significantly on government support. One of the good things that has emerged is that of all the different sectors in India, perhaps I would even be so bold as to say that the response of the government on the power sector has probably been the most cohesive and the most supportive. So if you look at the liquidity package that's come in, which is about 12 to 15 billion US dollars, and also look at the fact the government has used this opportunity to introduce some fairly transformative reforms in terms of the Electricity Act amendments, in terms of the new tariff policy and so on. I think they've certainly put a very bold step forward to say, look, we're going to try and fix these things. And even the way this reform package has been put together, it's addressing the problem at the DISCOM end rather than trying to address the problem, in a roundabout way. Now, we still have to see these measures play out and get fully implemented, and that's a big question mark. But sounds like so far so good on that. So I think the sectoral issues are really moving in the right direction. The macroeconomic side, I think, is still a big question mark. Let's see where GDP grows. Let's see where the affordability of the states to actually take power goes ahead. Let's see where how the capital providers really look at this sector. But I would say, by and large, the macro side relatively should be more positive for this sector, for the simple reason that as you get into a global disruption and uncertainty, in times of uncertainty, people fall back onto essential services. People fall back onto sectors where there's the minimum demand disruption. And so from all these different angles, I think it's the best is yet to come for the sector. One final point I do want to make before I pause is that in many ways, I believe this sector is at a moment of truth. We've just about reached around 10% of Indian demand coming from renewables, which means 90% is coming from everything else. And that 10% is what we're trying to grow. The sector reminds me, if I could use a slightly controversial analogy, of an adolescent. And adolescent where it's very clear that the future belongs to them. It's very clear that they have lots of energy, they have lots to contribute, they have lots of new ideas, lots of new things. But also sometimes the need to remember that as they take their place in sort of as adults kind of ruling the world, there are many additional responsibilities. And without getting too cryptic about it, I think the core issue I'm trying to get at is the true cost of renewables. And today, we are very focused on the 2 rupee 50 paisa bids or the 3 rupee bids or whatever that number is, somewhere in that range. But we forget that when it's delivered to customers, and if you were to truly add on the cost of, let's say, transmission, which is being absorbed by others today, or the cost of intermittency, which is being absorbed by others today, or the cost of seasonality, which is not even considered today, that 2.5, 3 rupees, someone may say that's 4 rupees, someone may say it's 7 rupees, someone may say it's 6 rupees, but it's certainly not 2.5 to 3 rupees. Now, as a country, particularly at India's stage of GDP per capita, I think it's now time to really have that discussion. And once we cross 10% of energy, it will not be possible to sort of duck that debate anymore. And I think that's the next debate that will be up for grabs.
Carrying the tone which you brought in, thank you very much. Very good points. Carrying the tone further, let me speak about public opinion. I came across a joke which a friend of mine cracked on the COVID crisis. Knowing my interest in renewables, he said that if there were more wind turbines in China, then we would not have had the COVID crisis. So I asked him why. He said, because wind turbines kill the birds and the bats. And so if it's because some bats escaped, that is why we have the COVID crisis. It was a macabre joke, no offense to any animal rights activist here. And I should also underscore my sympathy for flying wildlife. But I also found another public opinion coming, which was quite similar from an expert I was listening to, who said that COVID hits a couple of communities deepest. And those are the communities which renewables comes to rescue, the poor and the old. So the poor can get employment generation opportunities through renewables, and the old suffer from pollution the most, because diabetes, as you know, has a direct link with pollution, as particularly vehicular pollution. So have respiratory distress disorders, as well as several other autoimmune disorders. So this was just on the public opinion. You're right. Public opinion for renewables has suddenly, maybe silently, become very strongly in favor. The second point which you said was about the government's role. Yes, I would really applaud the Indian government's role, not only in the areas which you mentioned, but also maintaining the grid. Essential Services Act holds. People are making sure the power is getting generated, and they are there on their duties, and the government is doing a great job. And the last point which you said is that the adolescent should move in a manner which is more visionary, understands the pitfalls, as well as makes sure that he makes a space for himself without completely trying to uproot the powers that be, because many a time such partnerships allow greater longevity and success than direct confrontation. Great points. Coming to Ashish. Ashish, what would you like to add to the impact of COVID on the renewable sector so far, in addition to what has been said? Ashish.
Well, thanks everyone. Good afternoon. There is very little which has been left for me to say after my friend Vipul on the subject. Let me put across a few different perspectives, I think. Like on human body, on the system as well as power sourcing and developers too, COVID has put some stress, and I will use the human body as an analogy out here. If you look at where is the COVID hitting most, or which are most affected by COVID today, are those whose immunity was less. You may use the analogy of those who are poor, migrants, they are being affected for their livelihoods. And those whose immunity was less, maybe their age was more, or otherwise they have, I would say, the bad habits, they were not taking care of their health. They are pretty exposed to the current COVID era. And there are the most fatalities or the effect which is coming out there. Most of us who are healthy are going and sailing through it pretty nicely. Similarly, if I use this analogy on the power sector, on the renewable sector, it is also affected in a similar manner. We have apprehensions. Believe me, when it hit us, a lot of us are apprehensive. Like as a human, I was apprehensive. The first thing I did is how do I protect my family, myself, and similarly how to protect the organization. I think all of us have done well on that matter. We have been able, those who were strong has been able to survive. Those who were strong has been able to see across that this stress is not affecting them to the extent it should have otherwise. Similarly, on the renewable sector too, you would say that you would have observed that there were many in the field who have just come on a very aggressive assumptions. I am not putting the assumptions on the tariff part. It just reflects the end product. But you are going on assumptions which were so aggressive that any change in parameters on those assumptions have a major impact on your viability of those projects or your investments. And I think that is what has come on a stress and has been exposed majorly out there. Now, this is an era where it's too small a period to actually come out with those failures or successes. It's a small time. I always say that renewable per se is a marathon, not a 100-meter dash. But some of us has run this race as a 100-meter dash and have reached a milestone. But there are many, many milestones to go. And then you are home locked or you are in a containment area. You had it. And that is where I think that stage has come for them. For most of us, and for those who are looking at it as a long-term solution provider, who are looking at it as a business which has a sustainability and a predictability of returns, as a business which can provide a source of energy which is clean and is good for the society. And also, if you look at the projections per se, you mentioned about the oil and coal. It was also mentioned in this, and earlier I just saw opinion poll coming across on this side saying whether the coal and the oil prices has helped it or not. See, at the current level, the total energy which is contributing in the overall energy source, the total power as a source of energy is less than 30%. By 2050, we are expecting 86% or more energy being provided by power. And that is what we have to look forward to. If that is where the power is going to be the source of the total energy which will be consumed by this world, where is renewable, where is fossil fuel, where is nuclear, where is hydro? I think that is the main cause out here. It is a good time, it is a good break, it's a wake-up call for all of us in the industry to actually look back, go back to work, to the working sheets and see what good we did, what is the support which we need, what has helped us. I completely echo here Vipul's point that the government has come out very well. However, I also agree with Christopher's point that if we take today decisions in a haste, where we ring fence ourselves, that all sources of energy should only come from within the country, we are changing the whole dynamics. That dynamics may change the economics. I think it is a time for us to look how sustainable we can provide a good source of energy to our community, which uplift. At the end of the day, the GDPs have to grow. At the end of the day, the migrant laborers which has gone somewhere need a source of income. They need livelihood. And today, if we look around, renewable is also possible or has a potential to provide livelihood for those individuals who have gone back to their natives because they are more safe there, climatically and on the health side. There is also a point about, on a long term, where are the sentiments working? I do agree that these sentiments currently are for the climate change, which were happening and are hampering. But my sense is that in this world, when the hunger will strike, when there are other elements which will come into picture, again, you will have climate coming to the back seat and those economic fundamentals coming on the front seat. I think there are good points which each one of us has observed. each one of us has also observed, whether in the industry or outside the industry, that our investments in technology has paid off. Our investments in working on the fundamentals, whether it is fundamental with respect to the projects which we have installed, whether it is with respect to the quality of our investments which we have made, whether it with respect to the conservativeness with which we have worked for a future rather than an immediate game or a startup game, which was very prominent in this particular industry. I think those factors have now been exposed, and we have to a large extent some results too. There is not going to be a big change on a short-term perspective, if you ask me. And again, it is not a matter of a number game. It is not a matter whether India comes out with 14 gigawatt or 17 gigawatt, whether the tariff is 2.51 or a tariff is 2.76. I think it is more to do with what is sustainable. Are we in a position to consolidate? My view is that on a mid or a long-term basis, a consolidation will form out here, which will be sustainable, which will be good for this country as well as for this industry. I will also see that you will have a sense of being I would say independent from the vagaries which generally happens in other part of the world. Now, we were in a situation here that if you sneeze out in India, or let me put it in a different manner and without any offense, if anyone in China sneezes, many of the developers in this part of renewable, and especially in solar industry, catches cold. We were that sensitive to someone else in this factor. Was it really required? And in today's world, can we make those changes where we are self-sustainable, we can bring in the employability, which is possible in our growth. You can't stop the growth. It is there now. And it is neither is this versus that. Both have to grow in their own means. I think the important factor is that we have lessons here which we have learned. On a long-term basis, we need to continue to do the good things and try not to follow those which we have been exposed now and have come out as a major lessons for us. I think that's where we are.
I think, Ashish, you've really opened up the discussion. You have spoken from your heart, and I thank you for it, because now a real debate between friends can happen. Thank you really very much for that. You have said, now let me say, where is it that I may have a point adjacent to yours, not 100% in alignment, and where I am fully aligned with you. You have spoken about self-imposed weakness through smoking, etc. What about those adults who had no role to play in the hazards they were exposed to of pollution through their own habits? Point number one. Those are analogies, but I'm just putting these before I go to Neeraj. And the second is, there may be weakness coming because of the fact that an offer is weak. There may be weakness coming because of the chronology of evolution. A nascent will be always much weaker, even if he's going to be the dominant supplier tomorrow, but he will be much weaker than the existing giant. Those were the points on which, and the third point was, you have said that when hunger comes back to the front seat, then these things will take a back seat. I would like to ask the other colleagues, is it possible to give him his food, a man his food, as well as clean air? Is that possible? So these are the points on which I would like to debate further. On the points on which I 100% agree with you are renewables may have thought that it is all set for them. It is not all set. Geopolitics is changing things. Geopolitics is making perhaps the entire renewable story. It is putting a lot of question marks. And the other point is regarding just transition. What Ashish is also saying somewhere is that what will happen to those people who are invested in this area, those people who find their employment here, whose dining tables depend on this sector, conventional sector. How will you ensure a just transition? how will you ensure inclusive innovation? For example, when US wanted CFC alternatives to be developed, they asked the companies like DuPont, which were dealing in CFCs, to create those options so that they could take a part of that market. Inclusive kind of innovation for the existing sector. How will all this happen? And I will first ask this question to Neeraj and then come to Christoph and Gagan. Neeraj.
Yeah, thank you, Pavan. And thank you, everybody, all our colleagues who are listening to us. I think we have a great participation. Firstly, I've been hearing the different views on how to go about it, and I think everybody had very good things to say. So I would start by saying is that, firstly, I think we are going towards a 100% renewable future, and all the challenges which are there, of course, are there. But as we go towards the 100% renewable future, the question is today that how are the various type of power productions, how are they going to balance and how are we going to integrate it? And that seems to be becoming a big issue at the moment. When I travel around states and I talk to state governments, everybody has very ambitious plans led by the government that we should have more renewable energy. But unfortunately, I think what we have to really think about is now, so I'm taking the subject to slightly a different topic of discussion, is that how can we absorb more renewables into our system if this is going to be our future? And that's where we have to be very open-minded to understand that what are the various technologies which can help us to integrate the standard fossil fuel systems, especially our coal-fired systems, to the coming of wind energy, solar energy, storage, and many others, but today is, of course, wind and solar. And I think we have to be very open to understand this because our technologies at the moment don't allow much flexible generation. I mean, we don't have that big picture in mind here. And I would like to, open the discussion by saying that have we really thought about this? Everywhere, the percentage of renewables is increasing, and we are curtailing renewables in many, many states. I think what the government has to understand is how should they promote the ancillary service market? How should they create grid stability? How should they get the quality of power by absorbing more renewable energy into our system? We can keep looking at this. So the final, of course, thing is that all this is good, but the cost of power also has to come down. And that's important because in a country like ours, it's very, very important to get the right cost of power. It has to be at a cost. And some of my panelists have already talked about that. And what are we talking about? Fossil versus renewable. And it's always a good debate, it's everybody has a good view. But are we going to ultimately bring the cost of power down? As we have to make a concentrated effort to create flexible solutions, so we can absorb wind and solar more in our systems. And at the same time, we have to create stability because both these systems probably at this moment cannot give us complete stability in the system. So with that in mind, there are technologies here which help us to integrate, whether it's storage, whether it's hydro, whether it's gas engines, which can run for a short time. So nothing can be left. We have to look at everything, the big picture. And how do we integrate this more into our system? So this is the challenge, Pavan. And I think it could be a good, interesting debate that can we absorb more renewables into our system? Can we make sure that this is at the right cost? And it's not about the cost of power from one particular system, because if you just go by the government norms at the moment, where is the lowest cost of power coming from? Is it coal or where? But that's not what it is. It's the system level which we have to bring down the cost by having a good technologies to help us integrate these into our main system. We can keep talking about coal-fired plants running at low plant load factors. We can make them more flexible. But what is it we really want to do here? And this is where something which is interesting, and I think we should focus more of our energies also some part of our energies in this integration and creating a system of complete work going towards renewable energy.
Yeah, great point. So you have said that how technology can come to the aid, and maybe in pushing the renewable bandwagon forward, or maybe also in cleaning the existing energy from the conventional sector. There are technologies which are available which can clean up the energy coming out of the conventional sector. So, but coming back to the debate which Ashish started, and very pregnant with possibilities. So, Christopher and Vipul, I'm going to ask you now. First, Christopher, how will you ensure that just transition, which will allow that those who are losers in the march of renewable forward will have some kind of an advantage or incentive coming to them from this march itself? And the second point is, how will you ensure that renewables play that role of having the food on the table as well as clean air? And thirdly, how will you ensure that in the new geopolitics, which Ashish referred to as when one country sneezes, the whole world catches a cold? How will you ensure that your supply chains and manufacturing supply chains stay protected? It's a very important question for the viability of the renewable sector. Christopher and then Vipul, and then I'm coming to Gagan.
Thanks very much again. Excellent questions. So I think, can we have food and clean air? The answer has to be yes, surely. I think that there's a really interesting distinction in this discussion about what is the cost and who pays the cost. And I think we need to keep those two concepts separate. So, various panelists have talked about the true cost of renewables. I think there's also a need to have a discussion about the true cost of coal. We've talked about the fact that we are in this very heavily regulated sector, but actually often it's not very heavily regulated. The regulations may be weighed more on one side than the other and creating an unlevel playing field. So I think we need to be honest with ourselves about the true cost of energy. We need to be honest about the true cost of energy, both for coal, also for solar and wind. And then we can have a conversation about who should pay those costs. So I think there's a cost burden question here. And certainly it seems really obvious that in India, if renewables are going to be able to play a much larger role in the energy mix for electricity, someone is going to need to pay some pretty heavy cost burdens for integration. And who should that be? So I think there's an ethical conversation here. And this brings me back to my favorite theme, of course, which is the importance of the role of government. I do think that if we're entering an era, we're going to see government spending very large amounts of money into investing in the economy. This is a moment where the government can think about shouldering some of these cost burdens to think about the future. In terms of just transition, I think it's really helpful to continue distinguishing between the concept of recovery and transition full stop. So I think that we need to ask ourselves, what role can renewables play in helping to power recovery and create jobs? Traditionally, energy sector jobs aren't tremendously labor intensive. So I think in terms of renewables, DRE really stands out. So decentralized renewables tend to be a lot more labor intensive. They also tend to be struggling a lot more with some of the shocks from COVID-19 because they're smaller companies, they're typically medium or small size enterprises. So maybe kind of thinking about the role they can play for employment generation could be particularly important. I think also because it's so well aligned with existing policy. So, in India, we've got the Kusum scheme and kind of rooftop solar schemes, which are intended to try to contribute another 40 gigawatts of capacity for the 2022 target. So I think that needs to fit in. I think there's obviously just transition needed on the other side as well. And this is where maybe, again, international experience can be really helpful. I think that India has got a very coal-intensive energy mix right now. And there are other countries around the world which have been trying to downscale theirs radically, often because they're in a very different stage. of development, or simply kind of lucky in terms of the resources that they have that are alternatives. But certainly the EU, in its stimulus measures that have been announced, has set aside, I think, an additional 30 billion euro for a Just Transition Fund, which is intended to assist people who are working in areas that would be most affected by any kind of impacts from a reduction in reliance on coal for energy. So in terms of creating jobs and taking care of people at a very difficult economic time, if the pie is smaller for energy demand in general, and we're trying to work out, well, who will contribute less, I think kind of similar thinking about socially responsible just transition is really important.
Great. So very good points you have made. Thank you very much. You have added one more question, which I'm adding to the plate, which we are taking to Vipul. And that is of the true cost of fossil fuels. What perhaps is unsaid, and I would like to state it, that some experts say that the subsidies in the fossil fuel sector run up to 15 trillion US dollars. So if the fossil fuel sector seems to be more efficient, if you look at the cost of transmission, etc., which will have to be borne by renewables, then that is not the full picture. So keeping these 2 points in mind, this point in mind, what is your comment, Vipul?
Look, I think on the issue of how do we sort of sensibly make this transition, and I'm looking at, if you look at the next 10, 20, 30 years, how do we sensibly make this transition? I think the core issue is who pays. And if I was to characterize the situation today, we have a situation where the entire cost of the renewable transition, whether it's the volatility, the seasonality, etc., is basically sought to be borne policy-wise by 2 sets of stakeholders. One are the conventional generators, who absorb the cost of volatility. The other are the discoms, who absorb the cost of seasonality, who absorb the cost of intermittency, and so on. So these are the 2 stakeholders who are in the current policy regime as it stands today, absorbing the cost. Now, there are 2 other stakeholders that are very important here, maybe 3. One is, of course, the end consumers, whether it's industry, whether it's residential or farmers or whoever it is. Now, the entire sort of policy gamut as it stands today, in whatever is the realpolitik and the wisdom of the way what makes sense for India, the consumers are not really absorbing that cost at all, right? So the idea is protect the tariffs. Let's give free power to agriculture. Let's tax so basically the tariff policy has stayed pretty much what it is, with some deterioration, frankly. The other big consumer, the other big stakeholder, is really, I would say, an intermediary or a sort of arbiter of the national wealth, which is the state governments or the central government. So the state or central government are also not picking up any of that burden. Whether it's either through the transmission costs, or it's through taxation, or it's through whatever it is. So my fundamental belief is, until we have a transfer of the cost of this transition from these 2 stakeholders, which is conventional generators and discoms, to the consumers and the governments, we are just going to get into more and more of an issue. So far, till we've been at, I think the industry's done a fabulous job making the transition from 1% to about 10% of energy, but if you look country after country, the moment you start to cross 10%, it becomes more and more difficult to socialize those costs, and we're already seeing a lot of pushback. And it's not because these 2 stakeholders are not responsible or are not sort of willing to; they simply can't afford it. They are not set up balance sheet wise or mandate wise or economics wise to be able to absorb that transition. Now, by the way, today there is no technology which is clean, which can do 24/7 power through the risks of seasonality for a country the size of India, no matter what anyone may say about batteries and this, that, and the other. It doesn't exist today. So we still have some time to sort this out. Because if at some point, if technology, there's a massive discontinuity and you truly have something that can be around the clock at that scale, reliably, then frankly, I think the debate will get ended. We'll have a whole bunch of conventional generation that will just simply fall off the map. To your other question about employment and supply chain and so on, I think the one thing that COVID has shown us is the importance of sort of self-reliance, and I think that's the sort of cry that the government has sort of taken up. And I think the one point I would like to say about that, I'm going to pick up from what Ashish mentioned about over-dependence on imported panels, for instance, right? And that is the experience of the wind manufacturing and the experience of solar manufacturing. One of the transformative reforms that the government is obviously trying to unleash across the economy is local manufacturing, make in India, next version, substitute, and get a larger share in the supply chains of the world and so on. If you look at wind, we actually have some of the largest, some of the most competent manufacturers of wind in the country who have set up shop, who've created the capacities, and have actually delivered very well over the last 10, 15 years. Without getting into too much of, examination of whose fault is it and what happened and et cetera, et cetera. The reality is, 5 out of 6 of the top manufacturers are bankrupt or nearly bankrupt today. So what have we done with our wind manufacturing? We've taken probably one of the best examples of Make in India across the economy and finished it. Now, can we still revive it? Probably, yes, if we have a clear sort of pipeline of projects that come around, if there is, whatever, it takes. Now, before we now suddenly jump to say, okay, now let's do a massive Make in India on solar, let's make sure we have learned the lessons of the past and apply them. Otherwise, we'll just repeat it.
Excellent point. Excellent point. And before I go to Sidhu, Gagan, I should tell Ashish that Ashish has raised several points and some of those have been answered. But the one point which Vipul has begun to answer is coming in an important question, and I'll read it out to you so that Ashish can amplify what he meant by one country sneezes and others catch a cold, because this is a reality. And I'll just read out this question, which tells you what is the quality of the audience also. My question is, this comes from Akshay Parab. My question is particularly towards solar, what you have hinted already, Vipul. Currently, India is procuring 85% of solar material from primarily China, alongside Vietnam and Malaysia. Now, due to conflict with the major supplier China, how would it affect this solar sector? Should we consider this an opportunity for Indian businessmen to invest in PV modules, cell manufacturing? Should they take risks to invest? Also, the target of Indian government to increase the solar park installation and so on. So, I would like to add to this question to support what Ashish said so that we can find an answer among this panel. In terms of minerals, the Congo has recently raised the royalty on cobalt for three times. The prices of several minerals used in the manufacture of batteries or rare earths used in the manufacture of batteries as well as wind turbines and solar panels has gone up 3 times from 2016 to now. Many of these minerals are mined in a manner which is unsafe, and a lot of social protest can happen around the mining itself. So much of the raw material and components, etc., are coming from abroad. How can the renewables industry, supporting Ashish, what Ashish said, can make sure that they will be able to keep running their kitchen despite such dependence. The other point which Vipul said also comes from the other side, that you raised the custom duties on PV panels, etc., modules, etc., by 20%, and which is going to expire now in July. That increase. Did it actually make you make the product here, or have you ended up beginning a similar debacle as has been seen, as he mentioned, in the wind sector when we tried to manufacture? All these points in support of Ashish's point I bring up, because this point is still alive. It has not been sorted out. Other points have found some very fine explanations, and thank you very much for that. Coming to Gagan now, and then going to Ashish to amplify any other point which he'd like to make, and then coming back to Christopher and Vipul to close this discussion along with some more questions which we are getting. Gagan.
Thanks, Pavan. I think the way I look at it, we sort of started by asking ourselves and asking each other what has happened to, or how is green energy or renewables performed post-COVID. And perhaps one way of looking at it is that I see a few statements, a few stakeholders who have spoken, so as to say, I think renewables as a generation, as a stable generations supply source has spoken post-COVID, just based on the numbers I mentioned earlier on and Vipul echoed. I think developers have spoken about their confidence for renewables by bidding and tendering successfully for capacity that came out to market just in the aftermath of lockdown. I think the people who are backing those investors have also spoken, because if you look at the stock prices of some of these companies, take a look at the stock price of Azure, for example. Take a look at the stock prices for Adani, for example, Adani Green. Take a look at the stock prices of companies or developers who are there out in North America and Europe. They all have performed incredibly well. What the investors are talking, or what they're saying implicitly, is that they feel this is a sector which provides them some measure of protection against volatility, and therefore they are willing to accept a lower yield. So, if we see that the sector has spoken from a generation stability point of view, if the developers have spoken from the confidence they have in terms of bidding for capacity that comes right on the back of a major disruption, if you look at investors who are backing those developers, demonstrating confidence in this sector, I think it's time for perhaps to ask, what can the government do to support this sector going forward? And I think the government has clearly demonstrated its resolve to decarbonize the power sector as a result of COVID. But strengthening resolve is good, but it needs to be supplemented by some sort of concrete action and intervention. And I think that concrete action intervention falls into about 2-3 buckets. One bucket is on the manufacturing side. The second bucket is on the equitable sharing of real costs that Vipul touched upon earlier. And the third bucket is something that I would call the 2 Ds. That's data and debt. I think one of the big lacuna with this whole RE space is the fact that getting your hands on solid, actionable data is a challenge. The data sets out there today are at a national level, at a state level, or even a developer level. And whereas what really matters is to get deep down at SPV level, because you have developers with 50, 60 SPVs, and each one is contracted to sell power to a different off-taker. So data sets have to totally improve, I think, for renewables to move ahead from here. And I'll give you a tangible example. If you go to try to sort of raise project debt today for new projects, the lender is going to want to see not just anecdotal evidence, but real evidence of how much curtailment is actually impacting this sector or not. I think that's very important for all stakeholders, to understand how good or bad the sector is doing from a fundamental perspective. I think the other thing that needs to happen is debt recycling. We have a business which is project funded by Indian banks and Indian NBFCs, traditionally in rupees at the time of construction. And the banking sector today has an exposure of about 5.5 lakh crores to power. The two biggest NBFCs, REC, PFC, have almost equivalent exposure. So when we talk about significant capacities that need to be funded, it's questionable if the banking and NBFC system has the headroom by itself to fund all that additional capacity. So I think the other intervention that government can make is try to subsidize a recycling of capital via the local debt capital markets. So the two Ds, data and debt, in addition to the equitable sharing of costs that Vipul talked about, and interventions which target the manufacturing side.
Very, very good points. The investor interest you've said has been sustained. However, interventions are required. Secondly, resolve of the government is itself not enough. This resolve should be backed with a data-based, thoroughly worked out, watertight plan which can be rolled out. Because if it is not thorough or watertight, then what has happened in the RE sector with a lot of going to and forth, the electric vehicle sector, a lot of going to and fro and forward and backwards can happen. Very good points. Now I come to Ashish to add anything to the discussion. Otherwise, I'm taking the same point back to Christopher and to Gagan as to, in the new geopolitics scenario, how will you ensure that the renewable sector can really march forward unstarved for raw materials and components? Ashish.
Oh, thank you. Let me put it across that we all have to appreciate a fact. Energy was and is politics. We have seen wars for energy, even though they have been viewed politically. So this whole concept of renewable energies, if you ask me, has also opened me as a student of the industry, and as a student otherwise, I remain a student. You know how one country or few countries have changed the whole dynamics, where earlier the energy was you have a political power because the country where you were born or you are ruling, you are blessed with the sources of power. Natural resources was important. And all of a sudden, you have changed the dynamics from a natural resources to a manufacturing, which is then producing power. And from natural resources to a manufacturing industry was a big change. And then the whole dynamics have changed. And then you have captured the word. It's a study on itself. Why I am raising this point here again is because there was a question about safeguard duty and Indian manufacturing industry. I would like to give here two examples, being in India. One is of the automobile sector and the other is of the telecom sector. In the last 30 years back, or sometime back, many decades back, when India started on this automobile sector, the policy framework was that make imported materials or automobiles, cars in particular, so expensive and exorbitant that you only have one way to progress, that is your own manufacturing. After 2 decades, we have seen the results that not only there is a huge progress, there is employability, there is a quality of products. All the cars which are available all over the world are also manufacturing in this part of the world, and we are exporting to. We are not importing, we are now a net exporter of the automobile sector. Policy decision taken some time back. Similarly, there were policy decisions contrary to this policy for the purpose in telecom sector, where the policy decision was make tariffs low. And now we have seen a widespread change. The whole dynamics has changed in the telecom sector. The amount of tariffs, the widespread use, data, voice has been phenomenal. But both have come because of certain policy decisions which has long-term effect, which we can see today. And we look back, we actually know what triggered it in that period and how it has progressed. In renewable, what has happened is, one example Vipul has given, I'll give you an example in solar industry. What has happened is that we have followed more or less the telecom sector, where we looked for first the tariff. in the same process, we were also looking forward to make manufacturing to bring manufacturing to some extent. We are a manufacturer from last 30 years. We have been exporting more than 1 gigawatt. Having said that, we just can't compete with the imported materials. That's a fact of life. What happened is that today, on a policy framework, we are actually sitting on two boats. We want to progress. Both of them looks like a speedboat, but it is not possible. So we sometimes goes for tariff and then comes back to the made in India. And when we go back to it, we come up with certain solutions like safeguard duty. One of the friends has asked a question about the safeguard duty out there. It has not worked. It has in fact gone counterproductive for the manufacturing because all the current projects have a pass-through. And then you have an end date, which is coming by the 31st of July. With the pass-through and the end date, even if you love to buy from an Indian manufacturer, you are going to get more. I would say it is counterproductive because you are paying more since you are not even getting the duty benefits. So at the end of the day, the policy maker of these countries have to put their bets on. Where do they belong to? If it is manufacturing, then you have to take those policy initiatives, which we keep on hearing. So there are a lot of initiatives which have been taken. But then at the end of the day, manufacturing has to be a sustainable solution. If you look at China, and I'm naming the country out there, when they started their manufacturing, they were not looking for their inside requirement. They invested a lot on manufacturing. They invested a lot on their technology. They incentivized the industry in various manners. The power, their cost is much lower. The land there is virtually free. The cost of debt is so low. They have been able to produce then the products, which is now ruling the whole world. That's a fact of life because they, in early 2000s, have invested on that manner, supported that industry. We also have to do a similar fashion, and then it has to be sustainable. Manufacturing cannot be a transitory of nature. We need to have a sustainable policy because, and the worst part or the best part in the manufacturing of this particular industry is that the technology changes after every 3 years. As a manufacturer, I have to keep on reinvesting after every 3 years. So I have to look for a payback period of 2 to 3 years, which is not an easy game. So you need a hard-term support. And even if you look at the difference is not very high. Somehow, like I said, we were so consumed with this tariffs of 250 and this versus that, rather than aligning both of us. Whether it is imported modules of made in India or it is fossil fuel and renewable power. We got enamored with these numbers. Otherwise, if you look at it, the difference between made in India products and imported, if you look at it at a project level on a tariff, doesn't make more than 10 to 20 paisa difference in the whole tariff. And then when you have 250 or 270, sky was not falling and is not falling. However, we have made a sentiment now of a least cost power, which is coming from solar, which has not helped us. So I think to begin with, we need stability. The schemes like NCEBs, CapEx subsidies, SGDs are not going to help because they are very, very from a short-term basis. You need a long-term perspective. You need a long-term policy framework. And then we also have to look at whether it is not only the cells and modules. You have to look at whether the upstream industry are also grooming in that matter or not. It's not only modules here. You have to look at whether we are in a position to make wafers for a solar industry. Ingot for that. Do I have an investment in R&D segment? You know, where is that going to come from? If I'm going to leapfrog in 3 years to a new technology, I have to today heavily invest on R&D. Now that has to again come from policy framework. It cannot be left to a single industry to do all of that and then fight with someone else whose scales are 10x or 20x. So I think important factor here is the policy, which rightly was illustrated by Gagan.
Agreed. If there's anything, Neeraj, you'd like to add to this, and then I will take the ball back to Christopher and Vipul. Neeraj.
I think I'll keep my video off because, sorry, my network is not so good. No, I think this is a very interesting discussion, and I've been hearing my panelists about what I heard about the manufacturing side. I heard about what could be the government can do here. I think we all have to work together to make this sustainable. As Christopher said earlier also, who will bear the cost of clean power? How will it give us the overall benefits? Somebody has to bear this cost, and that has to be bought in at a certain cost here. I mean, at a certain price. So, if the general direction is that we have to go in the direction of renewable energy, absorb more, keep a good balance, keep a good balance of renewable fossil for some time, then I think the government has to take a more proactive role in giving us the big picture and direction here. And that's what I could understand from many of my panelists. So I think interesting discussion, and I would go with that. I would go with the floor.
Very interesting discussion, and really raising the quality of the dialogue. So I come to now Christopher and then to Vipul. The question, Christopher and Vipul, is clear that in the change geopolitics, if supply chains are going to interrupt for the reasons which have been mentioned, how will renewable sector still stay viable? Christopher.
So I think I don't have a lot new to add, but maybe a new way of phrasing it than some of the other panelists. We're really talking about trade-offs here, right? So we're not just saying, can we have food and clean air? Can we have food and clean air? And I also have all the food made in India. So we've had long discussions about the fact that we want to bring the costs down. This is going to put the costs up. So I really think it comes to points like Ashish has raised, if it's a 10 to 20% difference, is that fine? And is someone willing to pay it? Obviously the costs will go up, but the benefits will go up as well, right? So we're creating jobs for people locally. I think that in general, I would maybe just reiterate a few points I've made already, which is I don't think that on-grid solar and wind manufacturing is the most labor-intensive investment India could be making right now if it's thinking at a larger macroeconomic perspective about, how should we be trying to restart the economy. So I do think that there is kind of, I guess, a question around if you're going to think about really taking that bet and also saying, where are the places that we really want to be a lead, where would those be? I think EV really stands out. The automobile sector is very labor intensive. And I think it's a much better time in the life cycle of development for the technology for India to be jumping in and going hard to try and position itself, much more so than wind and solar. I think grid integration is almost certainly not going to be particularly labor intensive, but I think given where India is in terms of its renewable energy transition, taking a bet about being a leader in solving the integration problems that the world is facing. I don't think that countries have good solutions to 100% RE, and then being ready to market those would also be a really good bet to make. Maybe just one other reflection on this is I think someone earlier had mentioned that we're kind of in this area of, the electrification of energy, full stop. And I think it's also just really important to think in an energy security perspective about oil and oil markets. So if you think about the potential kind of risks of global supply chains for manufacturing of RE, I think they are nothing compared to the risks that countries have been putting up with for decades with petroleum products. So actually, I think we're going to be seeing a shift to a much more secure energy system as part of that shift in electrification. And I think that that perspective is helpful because I think it's important for us not to kind of overestimate the capacity for countries to cope with levels of energy insecurity and also how much better it may be getting in the next decades.
Okay, so a good point you make regarding the labor intensivity of the sector. Maybe EVs, the batteries are not so labor intensive, but charging infrastructure and EVs will be highly labor intensive. The question now goes to Vipul, that in the change geopolitics, where you feel supply chains may get interrupted, how will renewables stay viable or possible?
Look, I have a slightly different perspective on this. With due respect to everyone, I think India is closer to a continent than the way people around the world think of a country. India is 1/5 of humanity. Please understand the size and position of this country. India is 1/5 of humanity. So many of the traditional models of, this advantage, that advantage, we'll buy this, we'll build this, etc., they frankly break down, especially when you're talking about 1/5 of humanity and you're talking about something as fundamental to human comfort as energy, right? So if you look at it from that lens, I think that it basically comes down to manufacturing competitiveness of India in general. And to my mind, we are really standing at a moment of truth in terms of our manufacturing competitiveness as well. I used the same phrase earlier when I talked about, the 10% renewables, but the same is true for manufacturing. And I'm talking a little bit from sort of Sembcorp's point of view. One of our very successful businesses is actually developing and building and operating industrial parks. And the largest country that business has the largest presence in Vietnam, which is often talked about these days in terms of being a very attractive manufacturing destination. So if I could, from that sort of perspective, I would say that three things are important to make that manufacturing competitiveness. I think one is, of course, we've talked about fiscal incentives and so on, and those are fine. I think I'm not saying those are not important; those need to be there, but those are, as Ashish said, those are sort of tend to be sort of short term. They come and go. The two other things that I would strongly emphasize is one, the ecosystem thinking, and that is tough for a government or state government or set of governments or set of state governments to emphasize ecosystem thinking around a certain ecosystem is difficult. It is not an easy problem to solve. It's very easy to say, I'll go and make 3 presentations to investors and bring them in. But it is a really tough problem to think ecosystems and to figure out what is needed, how to attract them and so on, and not be so directive, because you can't be so directive. These industry chains are too complex to be totally directive. And so how do you make it attractive enough that all the critical points of the ecosystem do come in and are able to flourish? The third point is really that is really one of long-term relationships. And the mindset cannot be that we will do everything possible to roll out the red carpet for the investor who comes. But after the investor comes, it's up to them to survive, because we are like this only. The reality is you have to nurture these relationships over decades. So every investor who will today consider moving manufacturing to India will also be talking to 10 other investors who are already here. And of course they will come. And as you know, all of us, we all hope they will come. But those relationships need to be nurtured through policy changes, through mindsets of the bureaucracy, through the kinds of inspections, through the kind, when push comes to shove, do you consider an investor who's manufacturing already as someone, yes, his money has already come, so we'll see? Or do we really go in there and try to solve their problem? So I think these three things: fiscal and other incentives, ecosystem thinking, and long-term relationships. And just consider this, we have probably 3,500 or so, maybe 3,000 industrial zones in this country.
Yeah.
Probably not more than 30% of those are successful by any sense of the word. That is the industrial base of this country. If we can get this thinking in, that is really the opportunity which, it'll wash away all the arguments around employment, around raising GDP per capita, and so on. That is the potential that we have. I totally agree with the point that Christopher had made, that EVs is a very interesting thing. I think the current crisis will accelerate the transition, if anything. How much is manufactured, how much is not? I think it's a double-edged sword, because as you reduce the complexity of automobiles, whether it's cars or buses or two-wheelers, you actually also dramatically reduce that multiplier effect. And so that's a bit of a double-edged sword. But there are other things. I would say energy efficiency is a big area. especially because we still have a large portion of our industrial base to still be built out. And finally, I would say, in a call out to the to the conventional energy, even if you look at simple things like flue gas desulfurization, which is environmental equipment for conventional energy. Today, we are sitting on something like a 70 to 80,000 crore investment opportunity, where we know we have to do it. We know most plants have already got it specced out and are ready to go, but there are 2 or 3 policy things that are holding it back, where unless those policy things are clarified, no banker is ever going to finance those projects. So, and we want manufacturing, 200-300 plants doing 70-80,000 crores of investment. Investment can start in 3 months.
Great points. So let me just try to close this now. A great dialogue we've had on the point regarding geopolitics, disrupting supply chains. I would also like to come in. In 1950s, it was when we evaluated the copper reserves in the world. We came to the figure of 100 million tons left. But since then till date, we have extracted 339 million tons. How was that possible? Because reserves are different from resources. Resources are all that you have. Reserves are the mineable component of the resources. So earlier we were mining copper through one technology, then a new technology called EXSW came, and rather than copper being mined as copper oxide sulfides, it started getting mined as copper oxides, and so we still have a lot of copper with us. Which means whatever we are evaluating as very scarce resources may not be so scarce. So the geopolitic disadvantage is not so, let me say, fatal to renewables as we may imagine without looking at how technology will advance in this area. Secondly, even for minerals like cryolite, which was essential in the manufacture of aluminium, which we ran out of, did we stop making aluminium? No, we make even better aluminium today because we found good substitutes for cryolite. Similarly, we will, I'm sure, find substitutes to this geopolitic problem which has come if we will train our eyes towards the right scientific research and development domain which one of you spoke about, Vipul spoke about. So I feel surely there is some kind of a hiccup, but it doesn't mean that this sector is no longer airworthy, given our past experience. The second point which came, summing up, was the telescopic view. Governments need to have a telescopic view. They should be able to peer through the fog. Otherwise, as all of you said, that you will raise the tariffs today, tomorrow you'll cripple the existing manufacturing, then you will lower the tariffs, but then you realize the existing manufacturing had gone into coma and the industry is not non-viable. So the third point which came, a very interesting point which came, was that food and clean air both are possible. And renewable sector could be a way towards food and clean air. The fourth point which came was just transition is possible through inclusive innovation, where the people who lose are given a pie of the gain. And the last point which tacitly came was that our advocacy also has to be more nuanced and more comprehensive, where we make sure that the government is given a wide angle lens to look at things, a long angle lens which is unsmeared and which shows the reality, so that they can really peer through the fog, which tells the advantages of our sector of renewables as well as the pitfalls which may be there, so that we are seen as credible guides and so that the journey is really possible towards success. So these are the main points which I thought have come up from the discussion today. Thank you for such a quality dialogue. Really appreciate your presence. And now I pass it on to Siddharth.
Thank you very much, sirs. Our leaders and I have taken home so many nuggets from today's conversation. I'm still receiving a lot of positive messages. We may have missed out on some questions, but I will surely come to you and seek some of your time for the relevant questions. And thank you to our attendees for staying up till the end in large numbers. It's so good to see that. Whether you would like to engage with us on our expert panel or as learners, you're invited to connect with us as memberships. We are soon launching our exclusive digital networking platform, and we will be sending out invitations to select 1,000 first members across our 5 focus sectors. So thank you all, sirs, once again. Pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.